Poor girl helps millionaire to fix his Mustang when he sees the ring on her finger. Chapter 1: The Mustang and the Ring. In the sleepy town of Willow Creek, where the horizon stretched golden under a relentless summer sun, Lila Harper worked her magic on broken machines. At 24, she was the heart and soul of Joe's Auto Shop, the only garage for miles in a place where time seemed to move slower than the rusted pickups that rolled through. Her hands were calloused, her overalls stained with grease, and her bank account was a whisper of hope. But Lila's spirit was a wildfire, unyielding, warm, and impossible to extinguish. She loved the hum of an engine coming back to life, the satisfaction of fixing what others deemed lost. It was her way of mending the world, one bolt at a time. On a sweltering afternoon in July, a cherry-red 1965 Ford Mustang coughed its way into the shop, its engine rattling like a tin can full of marbles. Behind the wheel was Ethan Caldwell, a name that carried weight in Willow Creek. At 40, Ethan was a real estate tycoon, a millionaire who'd built an empire from nothing, buying up land across the state and turning dreams into skyscrapers. He'd left Willow Creek as a boy, poor and hungry, and returned a king in tailored suits, with eyes that held a storm of unspoken regrets. The townsfolk whispered about him, how he lived in a mansion on the hill, how he rarely spoke to anyone, how his wealth couldn't buy him a smile, cars acting up. Ethan said, stepping out of the Mustang, his voice crisp but polite. He adjusted his cufflinks, a reflex from a world of boardrooms, and glanced at Lila. "Can you take a look?" Lila wiped her hands on a rag, her braid swinging as she nodded. "Sounds like a carburetor issue, maybe a fuel line problem. Pop the hood, and I'll see what's what." Ethan's brow lifted, surprised by her confidence. City mechanics fawned over him, but Lila didn't seem to care about his name or his fortune. She saw only the Mustang, a beauty that deserved better than to sputter and stall. As she leaned over the engine, her fingers danced across the metal with the precision of a pianist, diagnosing the issue with a quiet hum to herself. Ethan watched, inexplicably drawn to her focus, her ease. She spoke to the car, her voice soft but firm, "Come on, darling. You've got more life in you yet." It was the first time in years. Ethan felt the corners of his mouth twitch upward. The hours slipped by, the shop's fluorescent lights buzzing as the sun dipped low. Lila worked tirelessly, cursing under her breath when a stubborn bolt fought back, but never losing patience. Ethan stayed, though he didn't need to, settling onto a rickety stool in the corner. There was something about Lila, something raw, unpolished, and real, that he hadn't encountered in the polished circles he moved in. They talked, haltingly at first, about the Mustang, the town, the way the stars seemed brighter here than in the city. Ethan found himself sharing more than he intended, telling her how the Mustang was his first big purchase, a symbol of the boy who'd clawed his way out of poverty, dreaming of freedom. As dusk painted the sky purple, Lila straightened, wiping sweat from her brow. "Carburetor was clogged and your fuel line had a leak. All fixed now." She turned the key, and the Mustang roared to life, its engine purring smoothly. She grinned, holding up her hands like a victorious boxer. That's when Ethan saw it, a thin, tarnished silver ring on her left hand, catching the light. It wasn't a wedding band, but it held a story. And something in his chest tightened. "Nice work," he said, his voice softer than before. "What do I owe you?" Lila scribbled an invoice. $150. Parts and labor. Ethan pulled out his wallet, but his eyes kept drifting to the ring. Curiosity got the better of him. "That ring," he said, nodding toward her hand. "It's different." "What's its story?" Lila's smile faltered, just for a moment. She twisted the ring on her finger, her gaze distant. "It was my mom's," she said quietly. "She passed when I was 16. Cancer. This was her promise ring, from my dad. He gave it to her when they were young, swore he'd love her forever. He left when I was 10, but she never took it off. Said it reminded her that love was worth believing in, even when it breaks your heart." Ethan's throat tightened. He saw the pain in Lila's eyes, but also the warmth. The way she carried her mother's memory like a torch. He thought of his own life, his wealth, his empty mansion. The walls he'd built after years of betrayal. People saw him as a dollar sign, not a man, and he'd let that harden him. But Lila, with her worn boots and her mother's ring, chose kindness despite her losses. That's beautiful, he said, and he meant it. She sounds like she was something special. She was, Lila replied, her voice steady but soft. She taught me to fix things, cars, people, whatever. Said you don't throw something away just because it's broken. Ethan paid the bill, slipping in a tip that made Lila's eyes widen. You don't have to, she started. But he waved her off. You earned it, he said. And thank you. For the car, and for the reminder. As he drove away, the Mustang purring beneath him. Ethan couldn't shake the image of Lila's ring. Or the feeling that he'd just met someone who might fix more than just cars. Chapter 2, A Spark in the Dust. The weeks that followed were a quiet shift in Ethan Caldwell's world. Though he didn't fully grasp it at first. Willow Creek, with its cracked sidewalks and faded storefronts, had always been a place he passed through, a memory he'd outgrown. But now, he found himself drawn back to Joe's auto shop. To the clatter of tools and the faint scent of motor oil that clung to the air. He'd make excuses, a loose belt, a rattle that was probably nothing. Each time parking the Mustang outside and watching Lila work. She never treated him like Ethan Caldwell, the millionaire. To her, he was just a guy with a car that needed tending. Lila, for her part, noticed Ethan's visits but didn't think much of them. Rich folks sometimes got attached to their cars, she figured. And the Mustang was a gem worth fussing over. She'd greet him with a nod, her braids swinging as she dove under the hood, her hands moving with a grace that came from years of practice. But there was something else. Too, a spark in their conversations that grew with each visit. Ethan would linger, asking about her tools, her techniques. And she'd answer with a mix of pride and humor, teasing him when he admitted he didn't know a spark plug from a socket. Wrench point one evening. As the shop's lights cast long shadows across the concrete floor, Ethan arrived just as Lila was closing up. The Mustang wasn't with him this time. He'd driven a sleek black SUV, one of his many cars. And he carried a paper bag from the diner down the road. Thought you might be hungry, he said, holding up the bag. Burgers and fries. My treat. Lila raised an eyebrow, wiping her hands on her overalls. You trying to bribe me, Mr. Caldwell? Ethan, he corrected, a half-smile tugging at his lips. And no bribes. Just figured you work late, and well, I didn't feel like eating alone. She hesitated, then shrugged, leading him to the small break room at the back of the shop. It was a cramped space with a wobbly table, a couple of plastic chairs, and a coffee maker that hadn't worked in years. They sat, unwrapping the burgers, and the conversation flowed easily about the town's annual fair. About the time Lila rebuilt a tractor engine for a farmer who paid her in homemade jam. About Ethan's childhood in Willow Creek, when he'd scavenged bottles for pocket change. Lila listened, her eyes bright with interest. And Ethan realized how rare it was for someone to hear him without an agenda. You ever think about leaving? He asked, picking at his fries. This town, I mean. You're good enough to work anywhere, big city shops, fancy garages. Lila leaned back, twisting the ring on her finger, a habit Ethan had come to recognize. Thought about it, she admitted. But Willow Creek's home. My mom's here, in a way, her memory, at least. And people here need me. Not just for their cars, but, for someone to listen when they are having a rough day. I want to open my own shop someday. Make it a place where folks feel welcome, not just fixed. Ethan nodded, something stirring in his chest. He'd spent years chasing deals, building walls around himself to keep out the users and the liars. But Lila's dream was so simple, so grounded in kindness, that it made his world feel hollow by comparison. That's a good dream, he said softly. You'd make it something special. She smiled, a little shy, and changed the subject. What about you? You've got all this money, this big life. What keeps you coming back to a place like this? He didn't answer right away. The truth was, he hadn't known why until now. Maybe I'm looking for something I lost, he said finally. Or something I never had. The air between them shifted, charged with an unspoken understanding. Lila didn't push, just nodded. And they finished their meal in companionable silence. As Ethan left that night, he felt lighter. Like he'd left a piece of his guarded heart behind on that wobbly table over the next month. Ethan's visits became a routine. He'd bring coffee. Or donuts, or just himself. Sitting in the shop while Lila worked on other cars. She taught him small things, how to check oil levels, how to spot a worn belt, and he soaked it up. Not because he cared about mechanics, but because he cared about her. He learned her story in fragments. How she'd grown up in a trailer on the edge of town. How a mother had worked 3 jobs to keep them afloat. How Lila had learned to fix cars to keep their old Chevy running. Her father's absence was a shadow in her life. But her mother's love was the light that guided her. The ring on her finger was a constant reminder of both. One day, as Lila worked on a customer's pickup, Ethan noticed a stack of overdue bills tucked under a toolbox. He didn't mean to snoop, but the red ink was hard to miss, medical bills. Mostly from her mother's illness years ago. Still haunting her. Lila caught him looking and quickly shoved the papers away, her cheeks flushing. Old stuff, she said, brushing it off. I'm handling it. Ethan didn't push, but the sight of those bills gnawed at him. That night, he couldn't sleep, his mind racing with an idea. He'd spent his life building wealth, but what had he done with it? Thrown it at properties, at cars, at things that didn't fill the emptiness inside him. Lila, with her patched jeans and her mother's ring, was doing more good in the world than he ever had. He wanted to help her, not out of pity, but out of respect for the woman who'd reminded him what it meant to care. The next morning, he drove to the shop, his heart pounding with a mix of nerves and determination. Lila was already there, working on a sedan with a busted radiator. She looked up, surprised to see him so early. No Mustang today? She teased. No, he said, his voice steady but serious. I came to talk about you. About your dream. Lila frowned, setting down her wrench. What do you mean? I want to help you open that shop, he said. Not a handout, a partnership. You've got the talent, the heart. I've got the resources. We could make something real, something that matters to this town. Lila's eyes widened, and for a moment, she didn't speak. Pride and hope warred on her face, and Ethan held his breath, hoping she'd see his sincerity. Finally, she nodded, a small smile breaking through. Okay, she said. Let's talk. That conversation was the spark that lit the path forward. A path neither of them could have predicted. One that would change Willow Creek and their hearts forever. Chapter 3, A Haven Built on Heart. The idea of Lila's auto haven took root like a wildflower in cracked pavement. Stubborn and full of promise. Ethan and Lila spent weeks planning. Sketching out ideas on napkins and scrap paper in the break room of Joe's auto shop. Lila wanted a garage. That was more than just a place to fix cars, a haven where people could come for a tune-up and leave with a little hope. Ethan, with his business acumen, saw the potential immediately, a community hub. A place where Willow Creek's heart could beat a little stronger. He offered to fund the startup costs, land, equipment. A modest building, but insisted Lila be the majority owner. This is your dream, he told her. I'm just here to help it grow. Lila was hesitant at first, her pride a stubborn hurdle. She'd never taken charity, never leaned on anyone. Not since her mother's death left her to fend for herself. But Ethan's offer wasn't pity. It was respect. And the way he looked at her, like she was capable of anything, made her believe she could do this. They shook hands on it, a deal sealed not with contracts but with trust. And Lila felt a flicker of something new. A dream no longer out of reach. The next 6 months were a whirlwind. Ethan used his connections to secure a plot of land on the edge of town. A sunlit acre with room for a garage and a small lot for cars. Lila designed the shop herself, insisting on a cozy waiting area with mismatched chairs, a coffee station, and a bookshelf for anyone who needed a moment's escape. Ethan handled the permits and suppliers, negotiating deals that kept costs low without cutting corners. They worked side by side, often late into the night, laughing over blueprints or arguing good-naturedly about paint colors. Lila chose a soft blue for the walls. Like the sky after a storm, she said. And Ethan couldn't argue with that. As the shop took shape, so did their bond. Ethan found himself opening up in ways he hadn't in years. He told Lila about his childhood. How he'd grown up in a shack not far from her old trailer. How his mother had worked herself to the bone. How he'd vowed to never be poor again. But wealth hadn't brought him peace. It had isolated him, made him cynical. Lila listened without judgment, her eyes soft but steady, and shared her own scars, her father's abandonment, her mother's slow fade. The way she'd learned to keep going because giving up wasn't an option. The ring on her finger, her mother's promise ring, was a talisman of that resilience. And Ethan found himself glancing at it often. A reminder of what love could endure. The shop's grand opening was set for a crisp spring morning, and Willow Creek buzzed with anticipation. Lila's Auto Haven wasn't just a garage. It was a symbol of something bigger, a place where broken things and broken people could find repair. The night before, Ethan showed up at the shop with a bottle of sparkling cider and 2 plastic cups. To celebrate, he said, pouring them each a glass. They sat on the hood of the Mustang, parked outside the freshly painted building, and toasted to new beginnings. You nervous? Ethan asked, watching the way the moonlight caught the ring on her finger, terrified. Lila admitted, laughing. But the good kind. Like I'm finally doing something that matters. You've always done things that matter, Ethan said, his voice quiet but firm. You fixed my car, sure, but you fixed something in me, too. I'd forgotten what it felt like to care about something bigger than myself. Lila looked at him, her eyes searching his. You're not as cold as you think, Ethan. You just needed a reason to thaw. The words hit him harder than he expected, and for a moment, he couldn't speak. He wanted to tell her how much she'd changed him. How her kindness and grit had cracked open the walls he'd built around his heart. But the words caught in his throat. And instead, he just smiled. Clinking his cup against hers, the opening day was a triumph. Half the town showed up, drawn by the promise of free coffee and Lila's reputation. Kids ran around the lot, chasing balloons, while old-timers swapped stories in the waiting area. Lila worked the crowd, her smile brighter than the spring sun, fixing a flat tire for one neighbor and checking an engine for another. Ethan stayed by her side, not as the millionaire but as her partner, handing her tools or pouring coffee for guests. The Mustang gleamed in the lot, a symbol of their journey, and when Lila cut the ribbon, the crowd cheered like she'd won a race. In the months that followed, Lila's Auto Haven became Willow Creek's heartbeat. Farmers brought their trucks, families their minivans, and teenagers their dreams of fixing up old beaters. But it was more than a garage. Lila kept a jar on the counter for donations, to help folks who couldn't pay. And Ethan quietly matched every dollar. She hosted weekly gatherings, coffee nights, where people shared stories or played cards, and kids' workshops, teaching them how to change oil or patch a tire. Ethan found himself there more often than not, learning to wield a wrench under Lila's patient guidance, laughing when he fumbled, his expensive shirt stained with grease. One evening, as summer settled over Willow Creek, Ethan arrived at the shop to find Lila sitting alone in the waiting area, staring at her mother's ring. The shop was quiet, the last customer gone, and the air was thick with the scent of wildflowers drifting through the open door. Penny for your thoughts? He asked, sitting beside her. Lila twisted the ring, her voice soft. Just thinking about Mom. She'd have loved this place. She always said kindness was the best kind of currency, you know. I hope I'm making her proud. You are, Ethan said, his voice thick with emotion. You're making everyone proud. Me included. She looked at him, her eyes glistening, and something shifted. Ethan reached for her hand, his fingers brushing the ring. Lila, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I don't know how to say this right. But you've given me something I didn't think I'd ever find again. Hope. Not just for this town, but for me. I care about you. More than I know how to handle. Lila's breath caught, but she didn't pull away. Ethan, she said, her voice trembling, I care about you, too. But I'm scared. It's big. And I've got so much to lose. So do I, he admitted. But I'm more scared of not trying. You taught me that broken things can be fixed if you're brave enough to try. She smiled, tears spilling over, and squeezed his hand. The ring on her finger gleamed. A promise not just of her mother's love, but of something new, something growing between them. They didn't kiss. Not yet, some things were too precious to rush, but they sat there, hands entwined. As the stars came out over Willow Creek, Lila's auto haven thrived. And so did they. Ethan sold his mansion on the hill, moving into a modest house closer to town. Closer to Lila. He poured his wealth into the community, funding scholarships, rebuilding the library, paying off medical debts for strangers. But his greatest joy was the shop, where he and Lila built something lasting. Not just with tools but with kindness, empathy, and love. The Mustang stayed parked outside. A reminder of the day a poor girl and a millionaire found each other. And the ring on Lila's finger shone brighter than ever. A beacon of love that refused to fade.